Hi, I'm tenny-brittian. Thanks for joining me. This is the Evangelism course from the Center for Ministry. In this course, we're going to cover the ins and outs of both personal evangelism and corporate evangelism. Now, this is the first of 8 video lectures. Today's video will provide you with a foundation on what evangelism is, what it isn't, why evangelism is so important, and to get you familiar with some of the terms that we're going to use in this course. So, if you're ready, let's roll up our sleeves, so to speak, and let's get started. I began practicing evangelism when I was about 12 years old. I was part of my church's evangelism team, and on Saturdays I joined the rest of the team in the parking lot of Value Mart. It was a precursor to Walmart. And we'd hand out tracts, or those, spiritual brochures, and we would start spiritual conversations. In middle school, I was so involved in my church and in evangelism that I earned the nickname Rev. They were still calling me that 20 years later. I learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work over those years, and made a fool out of myself, and I discredited the gospel more than once. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I've learned a lot. So jump forward to the mid-'80s, and you could find me in preacher school, where I learned effective evangelism practices, and I took those skills and started a church in Dothan, Alabama. By 1992, I was teaching evangelism to churches and church leaders across the nation, and I've been doing that ever since. Okay, that's enough about me. Let's get this party started. So let's begin by starting about Christianity as a whole. If it wasn't for evangelism, Christianity would be extinct in a single generation. And when it comes to Christianity, I have good news and I have bad news. So first, my wife always says, give me the good news first. On a global basis, Christianity is doing really, really well. Every day, 74,114 people choose to embrace Christianity for the first time. That's over 27 million people every year. But there's some bad news that goes along with that as well. Christianity is doing well globally, but not so well in Western Europe, Australia, Japan, and North America. We call those countries the West. In sub-Saharan Africa, India, China, South America, Indonesia, Christianity is growing rapidly. In fact, there are now more Christians in terms of raw numbers in China than there are in the U.S. And Africa is home to more Christians than any other continent, and indeed the face of the average global Christian is an African. However, in the West, Christianity is shrinking badly. Though things are bad in Europe, I'm going to shift this conversation to just talk about North America. I began teaching evangelism at the Center for Ministry in 2009. But in 2011, I began using video for the first time. I was reviewing one of those videos a couple of weeks ago, and I realized that I started this class out back then by doing the good news, bad news bit, just like this. So I want to share a couple of clips with that from the class with you. But in North America, which is probably your context, 92% of all Americans claim they believe in God. Now, that doesn't sound too awfully bad. That means only 8% actually claim no belief whatsoever. And we know that atheists and agnostics actually only make up about 2% of the population currently in North America. Remember, I made this video just 5 years ago, and 92% of the U.S. claims to believe in God. Today, that number stands at 83%. Then, did you catch the other statistic back in 2011? There were the number of atheists stood at just 2%, a number that has stood pretty steady for decades. Today, 9% of the population is atheist, and another 2% claim to be agnostic. That's not good news. But folks, we've only just begun. Here's another clip. However, and this doesn't sound too bad either, is that 79% of all Americans claim to be Christian. They have a base Christian belief, or at least they're willing to claim that in poll after poll after poll. Now, the problem with that, and although 79% is a huge majority, the reality is that number has actually declined for the first time since for the first time really in living history. We thought perhaps in 2009, when we saw it the first time begin to dip, that perhaps it was just a polling error or, the luck of the draw, so to speak, even though they use large pools. However, over the past 3 years, we've noticed that it has indeed declined 3%, and that's been consistent. We used to be at about 82% of North Americans claim to be Christian, or at least United States Americans. Back in 2009, when I first started teaching for CFM, 82% of the population claimed to be Christian. In 2011, it had dropped to 79%. Today, just 5 years later, that number has dropped to 70%. Where are all those Christians going? A very few, are turning to other religions. But the majority are simply giving up on Jesus. Gallup and Pew have been tracking these folks, and they've called these folks the religiously unaffiliated, but they're better known as nuns. The fastest growing religion, or the religious group in North America, is the Church of the Nuns. They've given up on all religion, but most especially they're giving up on Christianity. Now, of those nuns, the fastest growing demographic group are the millennials. Fully 35% of all millennials claim to have no religious affiliation, but they're being chased very closely by men. Today, 27% of all men in North America claim to be none. What does that mean in raw numbers? It means that every single week we lose 13,736 U.S. Americans from the faith. That works out to about 82 people turning their backs on Christianity every hour. And that translates to bad news for the church. And although 70% of Americans currently claim to be Christian, only 14.8% of them are showing up at a worship service on any given weekend. So how's that working in your church? Nationally, the church has been losing over 1 million members every year for well over a decade, and that number is escalating. We're losing more members all the time. In fact, it's so bad that we're closing 11 churches every day. To be honest, that should be tempered with the good news that we start right at 4 churches every day. Did I say that was good news? The current rate of new church closure is still hovering right around 80% failure within 5 years. So that means that this year we'll plant 1,460 new churches, but in 5 years of those churches, there will only be 300 of them left. So what's all this look like in the typical local church? Well, half of all U.S. churches haven't added a new member in over 2 years. Of course, that's no wonder, because when a church actually gets a first-time visitors, when someone comes through the doors, there's only a 15% chance that they'll ever return anyway. Unless, of course, you're talking about the mainline church, then the chances of return drops to about 11%. And I can tell you as a consultant that most of the mainline churches I've worked with over the past couple of years are actually seeing a rate closer to a 6% return rate. Are you thoroughly depressed yet? I hope so. The U.S. church is in a world of hurt. But really, it does get worse. With those stats, you would think the church would be banging down the doors to learn how to do evangelism, but that's not the case, and that's bad news. In fact, when I wrote the book Hitchhiker's Guide to Evangelism, the publisher told me that there was no market for evangelism books. He said they were still going to print it because it was an important book, that it wouldn't sell. And he was right. And it's true of virtually every evangelism resource in print, on video, or on audio. Evangelism doesn't sell. Now, the reason evangelism doesn't sell is because North American Christians, by and large, aren't interested in doing evangelism. And there are a couple of really good reasons for that, and quite a few poorer excuses for it. So, why don't Christians in North America engage in evangelism? I know that some say the first reason is because we're afraid of rejection, but I'm convinced that's not the number one reason. The top reason we don't do evangelism is because it's a cultural taboo. We live in a society that strongly supports freedom of religion. Hey, I'm all for that. But from freedom of religion, our culture has adopted the mistaken notion that religion is personal and private, which of course sounds really good to our cultural ears, but Christianity wasn't created as a personal and private religion. It's a social religion, one that depends on mutual support to remain true and to remain faithful. And Jesus couldn't have been any more clear when he told his followers that job one was making disciples. And the first step of making disciples is, of course, evangelism. But it's not politically correct here. We live in a live and let live worldview. If you're happy with your religion or with your non-religion, then it's not okay to do evangelism with you. Conversion, proselytizing, witnessing, and evangelism are all terms and practices that have, for all practical purposes, been banned within the North American church. With that said, let me tell you that you're going to need a bit of luck and a whole lot of Holy Spirit to lead your congregation into anything that even has a whiff of evangelism on it. The good news is the main reason most Christians reject evangelism is because they have a misunderstanding about what true evangelism is. In fact, most of those who would claim that evangelism is politically incorrect would change their minds if they took this course. Of course, they won't take this course because they don't believe in evangelism. So the church has to depend on the few people like you, and there are only a few of you, to take the truth from this course and get it spread out there. Okay, in my experience, that's reason number one why Christians aren't interested in evangelism. But there are a couple other reasons as well. First, fear is a legitimate reason why Christians aren't doing evangelism. Let's be honest, most of us think evangelism involves door knocking, Bible thumping, and script reciting. We think it puts our relatives, our friends, our acquaintances, our neighbors, and our co-workers in an awkward position at best. And if evangelism was about door knocking and Bible thumping and script reciting, then they'd be right to be afraid. The good news is, once again, they don't understand what real evangelism is. But by the end of this course, you will. Just a couple of other reasons. Because of our misconceptions about what evangelism is, there's a widespread belief that evangelism should be left in the hands of professionals. In other words, only the pastor is supposedly equipped to really do evangelism. Of course, there's a lot of problems with that, not the least that most pastors are so busy taking care of their membership and doing pastoral care that they don't have time to even get to know any unchurched folks. The final reason that Christians don't do evangelism is because we've gladly turned it all over to the church. Hey, we are good Americans, and we have a core belief that institutions are better equipped to handle anything we don't want to deal with, like education, senior care, mental health care, retirement care, and, of course, evangelism. And when we ask our church members how the church does evangelism, we're often told, well, everything the church does is evangelism. But here's the truth. In most churches, nothing the church does is evangelistic. Here's a couple of examples of what churches call evangelistic or outreach practices. Doing mission by taking up a collection of school supplies and sending them to the school. Of course, no one at the school, and certainly not the children or their parents, have any idea that Jesus had any part in that ministry. Social ministry and doing other nice things for others is generally not evangelism nor evangelistic. It doesn't have to be that way. Mission can be leveraged as evangelistic so very easily, but most churches refuse to do what it takes to make that a reality. They're content with deluding themselves and feeling good about helping out the poor, even if one never hears about the good news of Jesus Christ. Another is planning a big public event like a concert. That's another opportunity that most churches call evangelistic but aren't. Now, this could be a good way of sharing the gospel, but let's face it, most of these kinds of events have most of our members being the participants, not the hosts or the evangelists. These events are more often called, or more often are, fellowship events, and fellowshipping almost always happens between the members. Then, there are those events that churches do that aren't fellowship events, they're fleecing events. These events, like spaghetti dinners or pancake breakfasts, giant yard sales or Christmas bazaars, are designed to raise money to fleece the unchurched rather than to share faith with the unchurched. Of course, we'll justify it by saying that part or even all the proceeds go to some good cause, like our youth programs that we have to support because we don't have enough tithers in our congregation to support the programming. But to call these events evangelistic is delusional, even if we put a flyer in the guest bag that invites them to church. That's not evangelistic. It's not evangelism. But what about worship? Isn't that evangelistic? Not in most churches. For the next few moments, think about your church or perhaps some other church that you may be really familiar with, and consider the worship service and pretend you're a nun. Someone who hasn't been to church in years, if ever. You have no Christian history to draw upon. You wouldn't know King David from St. Paul, which, by the way, is fast becoming the majority of Americans. So you arrive on Sunday morning. You know nobody. It's a nice day, so you're in shorts and your nicest Marlboro t-shirt. And your tattoos are clearly visible for all to see. Of course, you're nervous that people are going to judge you. So, for a moment, think about your congregation. Is Wilma going to stare at you? Or is old man Charlie going to scowl or glare out of the side of his face? If either of them do, you're going to notice that because that's what you expect. Then some nice person hands you a bulletin, and the first thing you do is look through it. And there's a bunch of words you've never heard of. Narthex, introit, prelude, hymn, communion, doxology, gloria patri, kyrie, core response, responsive reading, litany, benediction. None of those words mean anything to you. You don't know what they mean. You may end up figuring out what some of those are on your own, but let me ask you, how comfortable are you feeling sitting there before the service knowing that you're clueless about what's about to happen? And then the music starts. The words are confusing at best. Here I raise mine Ebenezer. And you're probably wondering why the church would be singing about Christmas and Scrooge in April. Eventually comes a sermon. If you're good, remember last week's sermon for a moment. Just try. How relevant was that sermon to someone who's never been to church? And remember, those people coming to church, they're looking for answers to their burning questions. How to save their marriage, how to raise their kids in today's highly sexualized world, how to get off the bottle or off the pills or off the lines of coke, how to find hope through the fog of their depression, etc. If you're honest, you'll realize that the vast majority of sermons are written for church members, not for unchristian newbies. That scenario is just one of the reasons why the average first-time guest, less than 15% of them will return. But here's the kicker. Virtually no one who's never been to church suddenly becomes a Christian because they showed up at a church once or twice or even a dozen times. We know from repeated serious studies that it takes an average of about 3 years of intentional mentoring to bring a nun from their nunness into faith with Jesus Christ. So it's not happening at a worship service. And attending worship service is only a very small part of that formula. Why? Because virtually nothing that a church does has anything to do with evangelism. The good news is by the time you finish this course, you'll know how to change that. And you'll be able to do that without ticking off your existing members, at least much. Okay, so let's wrap all this up with some definitions. First, evangelism. What's evangelism? The word evangelism is a Greek word that literally means to good news someone, to share good news. I'm guessing you probably knew that. But did you know that evangelism isn't inviting someone to church? That's not evangelism. And it's not marketing to get people to come to church. That's not evangelism. And it's not handing out water while people run by at the 5K. It's not leaving a religious pamphlet, a tract on the back of a toilet stall. Evangelism is sharing good news with someone intentionally. We'll talk about what witnessing means later. And finally, here's some other terms that we're going to be using. Nuns. You already heard me use that. Someone who's unaffiliated with any religion. Duns. Those who were once a part of the church, but who have quit. And statistics show that they're unlikely to come back. Unchurched. Anyone who is not currently attending worship or other worship service or other church services. Never churched. Someone who has never been a part of a church. Okay. That's it for this session. I look forward to the discussion. Don't forget that you have until Thursday to answer all the questions from the lecture and from the readings. And you have until Monday evening to have further discussion with at least 3 posts, significant posts with content, with your fellow students. Don't just say, hey, great post. That doesn't count. Hey, we'll see you in the discussion forums. Thanks for joining me.